Hi everyone, welcome to Legal Research Module 9, where we look at a focus on data. And if I sound a little weary, it's because I've just managed to record this 20-minute version of this lecture with no sound, and I'm recording it again, so I can't help but feel a little bit stale going through this again, and hopefully it'll work this time though. Alright, so why is data important for a lawyer? And we are, as you know, everyone has observed, in an information age, and in the past, the idea of lawyers having competency in using information, let alone the idea of law as an information profession, was something that was more controversial. And there were certainly a generation of lawyers who said, I studied all my books all my life. I don't know what I need a newfangled computer for, or this internet thing. And I mean, that time is mostly over, and we are living in a time where the legal profession is changing dramatically, and so are the expectations on the things that you will be expected to be able to do as a graduate. And one of those is handle information, and to be able to understand data in all its various forms, and particularly be able to assess, examine, analyse other people's claims using data. When someone says, here are the statistics I've produced, and I've rationalised the covariant, and I've indexed the Q value, and this proves that I'm right and you're wrong, to be able to look through that and to be able to not understand all the jargon that people are using, to be able to understand whether or not it's likely that their claims are valid based on research methodologies. So I know some of you may have studied statistics before, some of you may not have liked studying statistics before. It's not a well-liked subject. We're certainly not going to do that in a week, but it's important to have at least some confidence and competence in that area to be able to function in a professional world. So you need to be able to read an Excel spreadsheet. You need to have some basic financial literacy. You need to be able to look at survey data or interviews and be able to understand what the point of the research was, what its weaknesses are, and whether or not it proves things that people suggest that it does prove. And one of the things I recommend in the study guide this week is a web series of videos which comes from a course on data called Calling Bullshit in the Age of Big Data from a university in Washington State. And it's an excellent series. I don't expect you to watch it all this week because it's quite long, or necessarily this term, but definitely put it on your to-watch list with on YouTube, and make sure you dip into it from time to time. And it's just a very, very good series of videos to help you keep up with the idea of what data is and how it's changing and how it's represented and presented, particularly data visualization, which is something we'll come back to in the workshop later on. Just a little cut in the video there because I'm getting paranoid now about it not recording, but we seem to be working okay now. Alright, so the emphasis here is, as much as we can do in a week, is to help you understand what primary research is. You're not going to be doing primary research as an undergrad student. It's something I recommend that honours students consider doing and think about doing. Although if you flash back a few weeks to when we looked at ethics clearance, it's increasingly difficult for students, even at honours level, to get ethics permission to conduct primary research. But it is a useful experience to go through, to at least run a survey and analyse the survey data or whatever. Now, so the focus for a graduating lawyer is really on being able to access, use, and evaluate research that's done by others, and particularly where they present contrary information, contrary stories, which is the one that is the most credible. And another challenge that we have with an information-based society is how much information is too much, and at what point does the information stop being useful because you just have too much of it. And you'll see that balance in the committal's issues paper. There's obviously reams and reams more data they can draw on than what they've presented there, but they've had to be very careful in saying, well, this is what we think is the right level of information to present with people in order to get informed information about their preferences and ideas. without overwhelming them with information. So information filtering is a key ability, and finding the right information, presenting it. Now this of course was never part of the legal skill set in the past. Lawyers would be able to tell their carbolic smoke balls from their snails in a ginger beer bottle, but they were not necessarily able to even talk across the table to a psychologist or a sociologist when they were presenting data. So we're hoping to try and go some way towards fixing that, and to provide you with some skills and some ideas, which of course are taken further in the honours program, in being able to work with information with other disciplines. The reading this week looks at qualitative research. Of course, there's quantitative and qualitative research, and curse the person who decided to give the two forms of research so incredibly similar names that you always have to double check every time you say it or type it that you've got the right one. But whatever, whoever decided that one. But the reading for this week looks at qualitative information in more depth. Last week we looked a little bit about the in the Burns and Hutchison reading about the challenges of matching up old-fashioned legal doctrinal research with data-driven research, and looked a little bit more at quantitative research, which is numbers, and qualitative research, which is context and information, is quite different. And this, it's a matter of horses for courses as to which you use for a research project. A lot of people have a preference, particularly policymakers have a preference for quantitative data. They like numbers because numbers can be easily compared. If you look at the increase in productivity over 2 different years, you can map them out. You can look at the 2 graphs and you can compare them, and you can see that. But if you look at a series of interviews about the reasons people have around their productivity, and you try to compare those, you can't just you have to read or summarize 2 separate interviews. You can't just lay them one against each other and compare them. So that's the reason why there is a passion for quantitative data. But as Einstein said, or at least had attributed to him if he didn't say it, not all things that matter can be measured, and not all things that you can measure matter. There are some problems with this propensity to focus on the numbers above all else. To give you an example, in terms of crime rates, you can see changes in crime rates, of reported crime rates and statistics, that unless you then go and do more qualitative research to discover the context and the reason for them, you're only guessing at the reason. Crime rate goes up. Why? Why is that? Oh, obviously policing's not working because we've got increasing crime rates. But you might find that when you actually look at the data, what you're looking at is an increase in reported crime rates. And the reason reports of crime have gone up is you're actually doing a much better job with policing. And people have more faith in the police, they find the police more approachable, and they're reporting more crime. So you can end up in that ironic situation where the police are doing such a good job that the crime rates are going through the roof. And until you actually look at the context and explore the actual qualitative context of that data, it just looks bad. And then you say, well, that policy's obviously failed. The policy of being more approachable and more embedded in the communities, obviously a failure, because all it led to was an increase in crime rate. So there's a real dangers around using the quantitative data by itself. What I find it tends to be good for is disproving things rather than proving things. Quantitative research is really good when you've got a common sense understanding and you want to see if that's correct. And often if the data matches the common sense understanding, it still doesn't really necessarily prove you're right, but at least it seems to be consistent. But often you end up in situations where the stats show that it's wrong. And an example of that was some research I did years ago on fear of crime with older people. And there was, older people report higher levels of fear of crime than anyone else in society. But when you look at the actual crime rates, older people are the least offended against group, except for elder abuse, but that's a different situation. If you're looking at people breaking into your house and, you know, stealing your stuff, older people least offended against people of society, but the highest rate of fear. And that's a situation where the data is interesting. The common sense, everyday assumption is that everyone's out there bashing grannies and stealing their stuff. But that's obviously not true. Why is it? And when you look into it, it's because, you know, retired people are home more. Breaking and entering, and a lot of crime is purely opportunistic. It happens in areas where, you know, you see a door that's open, you see that no one's home, you knock on the door, there's no answer, and you see an opportunity and you take it. But if you go, particularly if you have enclaves of older people where there's a street, where there's a lot of older people living in the street, very bad news for burglars, because there's someone going to, if you're doing something suspicious, someone is going to see, someone is going to report you. So that's, I think, an excellent example of where you start with, you know, common sense assumption, your data disproves that, and then you go, why? You look into it more deeply. But then you still have that problem of, well, what are we going to do about this fear of crime? And what are we going to do? And where does it come from? And why is this fear of crime so pronounced? And in the research we actually did, which was in the Knox area in Victoria, and this was 1998, I think. Seems a long while ago now. A lot of the fear of crime came from people who installed blinds in houses, like security blinds, and they were going around the community telling old people that, you know, Mrs. Smith from 2 streets ago was murdered twice last week by criminals, and if you install these blinds at a mere cost of $20,000, no one will break into your house and murder you. And there were these entrepreneurs that were actually creating this spike in fear of crime in one particular area. But also creating a spike in heat stroke and heat exhaustion and health effects of these terrified older people who were locking themselves away, pulling these secure blinds and locking themselves in unair conditioned houses in the middle of summer because someone was making a buck out of them. So that's a long way around the topic, but I guess I wanted to show that qualitative and quantitative data works together. They work together really well, but it's a matter of finding the appropriate thing for the right situation. And quite often we don't pick the right one, and often we pick what's the cheapest, which is usually your good old quantitative information, and we do use reductive methods. So you've all done those surveys, which reminds me I should push you to remember to have your say surveys. But you know the surveys with the Likert scales, you know, the level between 1 strongly disagree to 7 strongly agree. What do you think this is? And for finding out actual information about stuff, those things are usually quite useless. And there's lots of ways in which that data is distorted, particularly the fact that most people don't like doing surveys, and a whole lot of problems with using Likert scales to actually find out the actual information you want to find out, which is all qualitative in nature. You know, for the have your says, what we want to know is what was the student experience, and what things can we do to improve that, and what do people, you know, what do people want that they didn't express at the start of the course, that they realised at the end of the course that they wanted, which again is not at the right time to be surveying people for what they want, because you're asking them after the thing's done, and unless they're repeating the subject, and that's a whole different problem in itself. So, you know, like, we push those have your say surveys because they're the only thing we have. But honestly, in terms of actually achieving what they're supposed to achieve, having students speak to us in week 2 or 3 of the course and say, are we going to cover qualitative data this term? Because I'm really interested in that. You know, I'd like to actually do something more about that. Far more effective and actually valuable as a source of information and research than reducing things to these bulk of numbers that are really easy, cheap to collect and store and process and file away. And you can say you've done a quality process even though it's not necessarily had much of an outcome. And that applies to all forms of research. So often looking at the easy, cheap way seems to be the direct way, but it can have a counterintuitive effect where people think, oh, we've done that research, it's been done, and we've proven something. And you find that a poor research design has meant that you haven't proven anything at all. Anyway, so have a look at the reading this week, particularly the idea of ethnography. It's a really emerging area in law and using ethnography to understand what people's everyday understanding of regulation is. And that is a real gap in legal in the area of law and society. Is law is very abstract generally, legal principles or legislation, and we don't really have very good methods of mapping whether it actually works or not. And crime is a classic area where judges are always saying, "Oh, I'm going to throw the book at you and punish you more heavily," and that will deter others from committing crime. But when you actually look at the criminology data on that, you find that doesn't actually work. Deterrence doesn't actually work in any sort of meaningful way, the way we expect to when we increase penalties for crime. But you don't have any way of knowing that unless you have access to that information, and law is still reasonably cut off from those other areas. And a side point on that issue really is there are parallel complementary disciplines to law that I can recommend. Regulatory studies is an interesting emerging one, and criminology, of course, is focused on crime, so sort of one area, but is also one that's very useful. And I myself made that transition when I'd finished my law studies, and I didn't start from square one and do a criminology undergrad degree. I did a Master of Laws that had a strong criminology component. I did a thesis in criminology, and that got me into the world of criminology and opened up lots of doors. So it's good to have multiple strings to your bow, but also you can book a time to have a chat with me if you want to talk about any of these things. It's not necessarily that it's like, oh God, I've got to study another degree, or at least another undergrad degree. Sometimes you can get there in other ways, and sometimes you can do it through a master's or through research or through a PhD with the right supervisor that will give you the foundation knowledge in that other area as well. But as I said, I found that a very useful thing to do career-wise, because just straight law wasn't necessarily getting me where I wanted to go, whereas law and criminology was useful. And I think law and regulatory studies is something that, if I had been at the start of my career now, would be something that I'd seriously consider looking at. All right, I'm not sure how we're going for time. I think I've covered everything I covered in the first unfortunate version of this. The navigating section, the law section this week, looks at accessing information from other disciplines, which is always useful to know. The equilibrium section covers a couple of topics that are not directly related to the theme this week, but they needed to fit in somewhere, so I think they're useful to talk about. One is the concept of networking and what that means as a researcher, particularly where a lot of researchers are introverts and not necessarily good at researching. There's a bit of a reputation that law is full of extrovert narcissists who love standing up and making a spectacle of themselves, but that's not really true in my experience. Law has a lot of introverts because it's a very heavy book study area, and there's a lot of high functioning introverts who quite happy in standing up in front of a courtroom or a group of people and appearing to be very extrovert, but in reality are introverts, and I find the whole process incredibly exhausting. So there's some tips in there about, as an introvert, how do you do the networking thing around research groups in a way that doesn't involve just walking up to strangers and telling them how great you are. You can do that too. And the other thing is imposter syndrome is something to be aware of. And that's something that I'm find a lot of law students suffer from, particularly when you're among a group of people who all speak very confidently about something, and you think, oh, I must be the stupid person in the group because I don't quite get what's going on. And the truth of imposter syndrome is it's very widespread, and usually the people who do seem confident and do seem to have it all together and do seem, to know everything are also suffering from it and thinking the same thing. So it's worth having a bit of a look at that and thinking about, does that apply to you? And is that something that you can work on in terms of making you feel more comfortable and more balanced in your career, so you're not spending your whole career just constantly thinking you're a fraud and that you somehow managed to slip through law school without anyone noticing that you're a fraud. Because the people who are frauds never think that anyway, so maybe if you don't think you're a fraud, maybe you should be worried about that. But I think the chances are more often the other way around, and a lot of law students do suffer from confidence and maybe good at hiding that, but they often do suffer and need a bit of think about that idea of imposter syndrome. And finally, the workshop for this week is on visualizing data. Again, as usual, it's not a huge or time-consuming process. It's just a matter of finding a set of data from the research, and the committals report is full of them. It's full of information on, budgets and costs and delays and rates of process and whatever. There's a lot of numbers in that report. And taking a little bit of data and producing a visualization, whether it be some kind of chart, a pie graph, a bar chart or whatever, infographic, full 3D animation if you wanted to, but you're not going to get more than 1 mark for it anyway. But just working through that process. And I mean, the good news is Microsoft Word has 1,000 different options for producing easy graphs that look fantastic from data. I can't really give you a direct guide to that because they change their tool set every few weeks apparently, and every time you go in there's new things there. But there's probably good stuff in YouTube if you're struggling, but I don't think you will, because I think it's quite straightforward and you can just open up the graphs and put the data in and see what you get. So this week I wanted you to think about that process, about when you are in professional life and facing a situation where you do need, for a report or a presentation, to be able to produce a professional looking graphic, how those tools are available to you, how easy it is to do, but then also to be able to challenge those when other people do it and go, oh, your PowerPoint looks very professional, however, I have some questions about the methodology by which you derive those statistics. So we're not going to be able to do everything. We're not going to be able to replicate an entire research degree in 1 week, but there's a lot of issues there I wanted to raise, I want you to think about, and things to talk about if you want to talk about them.